All right. Well, thank you, Russ. All right. Hi, everybody. This is Global Navigation with SPFX. I'm going to show the slide that everybody's probably shown you more than once already today. Oh, we're not going to do that. There we go. Shameless plug for the SharePoint conference in Vegas, or the Microsoft 365 conference next year in Vegas. And also, why am I not? There we go. Thank you to all the sponsors for the event for helping make this happen. All right, so my name is Derek Cash-Peterson. I'm a principal architect at Simpraxis Consulting. We are a small 6-person firm based more or less out of Boston. I've been a professional developer since 1999, back when we used to take, do UI with tables and spacer GIFs. But I've been working with SharePoint since about 2006, working predominantly with the Microsoft Content Management Platform, building public-facing websites. And I specialize in branding and UX development. Here are some of the ways that you can get in touch with me. I've got them at the bottom, at the end of the deck, so you don't need to take any screenshots or anything. But that's my blog, my LinkedIn, my Twitter, and obviously my GitHub repo, which is where the code samples from today are going to be put. All right, so like I said, today we're going to talk about global navigation using the SharePoint framework, and specifically getting a jump start on that using the PnP Dev Extensions, and how I leveraged those to create a quick and easy navigation component. Now, the reason why this session even came about was I was doing a session on how to leverage Flow to generate navigation, and with this code base. And in doing that, part of all the questions that were coming out of that session really made me step back and realize that that the folks I was speaking with actually didn't know even what an application customizer was, or how to get that first step, get that code up in the SharePoint app catalog to begin with. So I wanted to make sure that I took a step back and sort of started there and let folks know, where and why and how they can leverage code to quickly get some global nav all set. Okay, so here's our agenda for our session today. It's a little ambitious for 50 minutes, but first I want to answer a really important question before anybody builds any custom components on any platform, which is the why. Why should you build your own? Then I want to take a look at some of the components that you need. What are the different building blocks that you need in order to make a global navigation component using SPFX? As I said before, and David alluded to this in the last session, was using PnP Dev Extensions, which is a great place for some code samples and things to help jumpstart your development effort. And then we're going to really spend the bulk of the session, bulk of the last half of the session looking at actual code that I used to get the navigation working in both SPFX and in classic SharePoint. We'll take a quick peek at some of the deployment questions, and at the end, we will hopefully have time for question and answer. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is why would we want to build our own? And I will confess, I'm a developer, so sometimes I fall into that mindset, right? Where, just because I'm a hammer, everything is a nail. And as a developer, I say my first gut reaction to any problem tends to be, oh, I can just write a web part for that. I can write an application customizer for that. I can just do this. And it's really important to make sure that you take a step back and you ask yourself, why? Why do you need this? Because custom code isn't always the answer. It does inherently create code that you need to maintain, and that's great for job security, but it's not always the right answer for your organization. So I always like to ask myself quite a few questions before I do this. So first of all, why would you want to build your own? If you need your global nav to be on every site, regardless of hub association, right? So we have hubs, and you can create hub site navigation, and that works great as long as you have a single hub site, and that's fine for a smallish intranet. But what happens if you've got a sales hub and a marketing hub, and you need to knit all that together and you need consistent navigation? Well, you're either writing an app customizer or you're manually editing some code or some navigation links all over the place. And that's not really a great way to maintain that. What if you need a custom user interface? Now, if you've looked at the hub site navigation, right, you'll notice if you start adding links, there's a lot of white space in there, and white space is great. It has its time and place. However, once you start to have 4 or 5 things in that hub site navigation, it tends to take over the page. So if you need to tighten that up, if you need to sort of build your own custom mega menu, then that's the kind of thing that you may want to build your own component for. Also, if it needs to work on classic and modern, hub site nav only works on modern sites, right? Application customizers only work on modern sites. They don't work on classic. So you may want to build your own custom component here. In addition to sort of that custom user interface or multitasking on both classic and modern, if there's any functionality that you don't already have as part of the navigation. Now, I have this one in here for audience targeting. I haven't seen it out in my tenant yet, but I have seen on the Twitterverse about audience targeting being out. But so as some of those things are rolling out, that's great. But if there's functionality that you need in your particular instance or thing, that's a perfectly logical reason for you to create your own navigation. And the final question that I always want to make sure I ask myself is, has anybody done this before? This is a really great conference, and there's lots of people who are here that are trying to share what they know, their experience in working in the field. And in general, I would say that someone has encountered your problem before and either posted it to Stack Exchange, added it to PnP, or wrote a blog post about it. And so it's really important to make sure that you check and see if someone else has done this before, because they may help get you there quicker. For the sake of this session, we're going to assume that we do need to build our own. And we need to do that because it needs to work on both classic and modern. So what are the different components that make up this piece, that make up all this work? The first off are the placeholders. And in modern, SharePoint gives us, Microsoft gives us 2 places, top and bottom, to add customizations. And we're going to talk about those in a minute. We also need our data source. So where is this data coming from? How are we managing those navigation links? And then we need to get it on the page. So for modern, that looks like an application customizer. For classic, that's using JS Link. And finally, and this is sort of a change, and partially to what David was talking about earlier, is you want a common set of code, right? You don't want to have to edit the header control twice, once for classic and one for modern. You want to make sure that you have one solid common code base that you can update once and then have it work across all your sites. Okay, so placeholders. So the placeholders are obviously a place in the document object model that's been designated by Microsoft for us to make changes to. Right now in modern, there are 2. There's top and there's bottom. As a developer, we always want more options. So I would love it if there were, but right now, those are the 2 that we have. Those are really designated as the safe zones for customizations, right? Microsoft has said, okay, folks, we've got most of the sandbox, but we're going to give you these 2 little spots for you to put your stuff in, and we're not going to change that. And so that's really other than a web part, those are our safe zones. Those are our places to put our content. Now, it's really important. I've looked at code from other developers, and they say, oh, well, if I can just get on the page, then I can start manipulating other things. Please don't do that. That is not good. That is not best practice, and that is not supported. Don't manipulate the DOM outside of the placeholders. Generally, if you put it in, you can play with it, but don't play with anything outside of those individual placeholders, because your stuff may break and you may end up getting a call at 2 o'clock in the morning when your site doesn't load because your navigation control broke because you edited the DOM. Okay, so where are those placeholders? If you haven't worked with application customizers before, you wouldn't ever know that these things exist. There are two placeholders in the HTML of the modern page, and this is just a screenshot of what's there. So we've got at the top, it's directly between the hub site navigation and the sweep bar, and then at the bottom, it's right at the bottom of the footer. And so when you write your application customizers, that gets injected into those two spots. All right. So that was the placeholders. Now let's talk about the data sources. So we have quite a few options in terms of where we get the data for our navigation. For the sake of this example and this session today, we're going to read from a JSON file in a SharePoint library. Now, that is great if you have a developer that's maintaining that JSON, because we can, look at it and we can know that our curly braces aren't aligned, or, we can, realize that we need brackets here or curly braces there and string, and quotes here. That's not always a great solution for business people who may be in charge of updating the navigation. So sometimes you may want to think about doing that with a SharePoint list. And as I said, the impetus for this whole conversation today was using SharePoint lists and Power Automate Flow to generate a JSON file so that my business users could actually go in and edit a SharePoint list and have that trigger off a flow that then compiled all the links and all the data I needed into a JSON file, and then the navigation control edited the JSON. We're going to go a lot more simple today. We're simply going to fetch the JSON file, but you get the idea that once you have the JSON file, you can actually create it in many different ways. You could also create an Azure function that you could call via REST to bring back, to transverse the list of sites or a list of this or that. You could put a file in Azure Blob Storage. You really have a lot of open possibilities for how you can get the data out. All right, so then we've got the application customizer. So if you don't know already, an application customizer is just a way using SPFX that allows us to inject those customizations. It's a project template that we can use, and it gets deployed out and determines what, and embeds the code that we're writing into one or both of those placeholders. And we're going to take a quick peek at that earlier today. All right, so that's sort of the anatomy. I did talk about JSLink, but I didn't want to put together a slide about JSLink because we're going to actually look at the code to do that in a little bit. So let's talk about PnP and where I started this journey. So, a lot of folks talk about PnP and what is it? And so it stands for Patterns and Practices. It is a community-driven site or collection of sites, code samples, and whatnot. It covers, as I said, code samples, community-driven best practices. And that's really important because there are folks like myself, Mark Anderson, who are really driving the effort to get more knowledge out there. And to help folks who are just starting with SharePoint learn the current best practices for the way to do things. There's also a reference to the lookbook. So if you haven't seen the lookbook, it's an amazing resource. It gives you the ability to see sort of the art of the possible of what you can do visually with SharePoint and different components. In whether or not those are custom components, how to configure those components. You can also provision those templates right in your site. So it's very cool. There's also a link to the SPFX generator there, which is an add-on. It sits on top of the Microsoft Yeoman generator for developing projects and helps add in, just automate some of the things that you would normally add to your projects, like a pipeline for Azure DevOps, or adding in the UI fabric, or some of the PnP.js stuff. There's really just so much there, and there is a link to a site right there, which is the new PnP GitHub site. And we're going to go take a quick look at that now. And we're going to switch over to actually do that and then look at some code. So we're going to try to use Magic and switch over to a browser. Lovely. All right. So here's the PnP site so far, and you can see this is one of my favorite things is the community calls. So you can actually download these calendar or Teams invites, and you can hear the latest information about PnP or the different components: SharePoint Framework, Power Apps. You can also get guidance on those best practices. So this is the community content guide. And that's where you can find sort of best practices on how to build your sites. What are the best practices for site columns and content types? Also guidelines on how to contribute, which is really important because this community only gets better if people contribute to it. You can also buy cool merch. But what we're focusing on are the framework extensions. And this is a link that if you click it, it actually brings you to a list of all sorts of different, community different extensions that folks have submitted. And you can see there's lots of names of folks that you may know. Personally, I'm looking for an app customizer, and I'm looking for a React menu. And that one's not it because it's the mega menu. I'm working with the React menu footer Classic and Modern by Bob German, and he worked on that. And get the idea. Oh, there it goes. So you can get a link right over to the GitHub repo. I actually have this repo cloned on my development box so that I can reference it and see what's there. Because at the end of the day, what I said before about sort of people checking to see if people have done this before is really important, because Bob and Julian's other members of the community have really taken a lot of time to make sure that this code works, and you can do that. I suggest that everybody take a swing around there and see what's there before they start building their own code. Okay, so now let's switch over and head over to our good friend Visual Studio Code. How is the type size on this? Russ, can you, is this readable?
From what I can see, yes.
All right, great, excellent. So this code we wanted to chunk this up into 3 projects. We've got code for an application customizer. We've got code for Classic. And then we have a common set of code. So we only have to modify one set of code for all the main work. So what we're looking at right here, this is the common project. You probably can't see that, it's too small. But I have one common project. It's just a very basic React, project. And I'm gonna walk you through it. And so this is where all the guts of all of our work here is. So we've got quite a few files. We've got our launcher, which we're gonna talk about last. We've got our data service. Let me pull this over like this. We've got some sample data, which is our JSON file. We've got our data model. And then we've got our components. We've got our header, our footer, and our CSS file. So I'm going to take a look. I'm going to start with that data service, because that's really the guts of how we get at what we've got. So we have a function here that accepts a URL as a parameter, and it goes and it gets that URL. Now that URL is going to be the link to our JSON file. When it's done, it parses the results as JSON and sets that to iHeader footer data, which is part of our data model. Now, then it has some error handling so that if it fails, it gives you a nice fun error that says it failed. Okay, but that's really all the data service does, because it's a data service. It gets the data. Here's the data that it's getting. So this is formatted JSON. Now we've got our footer links, and inside our footer links, we've got an array of elements which have a name, a URL, and a child. Children are an array as well. Then we've got our header links, same concept. So what you'll see here is this is great for me. I can load this into Visual Studio Code and be super happy with this. I can make sure that I have everything all lined up and everything look good and I've got all my commas in the right place. This is kind of gnarly for a business user. So, I would recommend looking at some things about how to automate the creation of this. But moving on, we want to move on to our data service. I mean, not our data service, our data model. So in our data model, we've got our header footer data, and it's got two properties on it, header links and footer links. They are an array of the link object. And link is name, URL, and an array called children. So you're starting to get the different pieces here. So this JSON data represents this document, which contains these properties. And so it all sort of like lines itself up. Okay, so now we've got our data, we got our data, we populated into objects that we can work in. So now let's check out the controls. So this is the header control. And again, we wanted to go, excuse me, we wanted to go super simple with this. It's pretty basic CSS, but it is responsive, and you are welcome to change this code as you wish. So this first section is just setting it up. So we've got a div with the top, called top nav. We have the hamburger menu. And that just populates when it goes into mobile mode. It populates the three, the three bars. We have the checkbox. The checkbox is sort of an old hack to simulate a button click and be able to show or hide things based on clicking or tapping versus using JavaScript to instantiate the opening and closing of the menus. So we had to pop that in there for mobile. And then we just have a basic UL. And then we are passing in, I forgot to check out the headers, the header properties. So when we instantiate this, we need to pass it in the data that it needs to use. So it's going to take in an array of link. So when we get down to our UL, we're actually going to iterate through that list of links. And we're going to pop the name in as a key for the LI. For the href, we're going to put in an href with the URL field. And then the name is what's going to get displayed. And then we're going to check to see if there are any children. If there are children, we're going to iterate through the array of children. Now, this example is really only 2 levels. So for example, we're going to have departments, and then we're going to have, HR, finance, et cetera, et cetera. You could easily modify this HTML to be a mega menu. You could make it 3 levels. You could make it 4 levels. To be honest, from a UX perspective, I wouldn't make it more than 2 levels. I mean, more than 3 levels, because you start to get too much data in the navigation. And then we just close off the navigation. We close off all the tags. So close the UL, close the UI. This is what gets rendered when this control gets instantiated. And if we switch over to the footer, we're going to see something very similar. It's a lot simpler because the footer has an extra property on it called message. So we're gonna put out a string that says, copyright information. And then we've got the array of links. Again, this example, super simple, div called bottom nav. We output the span tag with the message. And then we've got the ULs that outputs the links. Now, the footer outputs them horizontally. You could, again, very easily make this expand and collapse. You could make them go up in ordered lists and make this a big footer. I will say this is present on all pages at all times at the very bottom of the screen. So you really do need to be careful that you're not making your header come down too far and your footer come up too far, or else you're going to be left with like no screen real estate on your page, especially if you're looking at it on a laptop. All right. Okay. So, and then finally, we've got our CSS. What we've done here is what I've done here is set up just some CSS variables with some spacing, and then a whole bunch of colors that I've made for this demo. Again, you can use this to connect your navigation to your theme. You can also connect it to the UI fabric. You can also just change these and make these different colors. We've got our HTML to set up the lists and the list items. So we're making it sort of wide. Oops. Min width is 140, so we're making it sort of wide, giving it a specific height, giving it a font family. If you want to change the font, you can. And then we're just setting some of the hovers. This is pretty, there's nothing wild and crazy happening in this CSS. Here's the CSS for the show menu button. So when you want to go and when you get to mobile view, it will show the button for the hamburger, and here's the code for the hamburger. And then finally, it's really important because this is responsive, we want to make sure that we've got our breakpoints set in here, and we're making the changes that we need to make specific to the different UI. And you can see instead of going straight across the screen, we're going to make these things stack on top of each other, which is this width of 100. And then we want to make sure that we show the menu. We also have some code for a bottom nav, which just sets up the wide piece at the bottom. And we're using Flexbox to push the message to one side and the navigation to the other side. And that's pretty much it. We're setting the UI. We're setting the LIs and the hover. And one thing I know I told everybody not to edit the DOM. The little feedback button annoys me, so because it gets in the way of my footer. So I added this to hide the feedback button at the bottom of the screen. One thing I will say is just be aware that this can break, right? If Microsoft changes the DOM and they change the class that it's using from feedback to info, this breaks and your button comes back. So just be aware that if you're going to do something that breaks the rules, be intentional about it and make sure that you remember it so that when you get a feedback link, nobody freaks out and you can just go and make a quick change and edit it. All right, so the last file here, so everything we've been looking at to this point is really getting the data, formatting the data, and then putting it into the controls. So now the last file we're going to look at is the launcher. The launcher is the one that does some serious work here. And what this does is it accepts some properties, it accepts the div, an HTML div element, the div element that you want to put your control in. Then it accepts the control that you want to put in the page. So in this case, a header or a footer control, and a properties object of the control that you want to put in. So the element that you're going to put in, the control that's going to go in the element, and then the properties of the control that you want. So inside the launcher, we create 3 private variables here. And these are just so that we can then go down here and pass the properties into them and just work with them inside the launcher. So we do that, we put that in a try catch to catch the exceptions. We have a launch function, a public launch function that when it is launched, when it's called, it then calls the render header method, which is private. So inside the render header method, we are creating a React element that has the React control that we passed in. So in this instance, the header, and then in this, the properties for that header. So we're going to pass in the header component, the header control, and iHeader props. And inside those iHeader props are going to be the link that we want, the links that we want the header to render. So container then turns out to be my header component. And then we're going to use React DOM to render my container element into the DOM element that I passed in. And that's it. This is basically all encapsulated so that its job is to render and output the code that you want to deploy. Now, there's one last file that I want to show, and that's the index. Well, in this project, We are because, as I said at the very beginning, we're creating 3 projects, one for Common, one for Classic, and one for SPFX. We need a way to get that data from this Common project into our SPFX and our Classic projects. So in our index.ts file, we're actually importing all of those things that we need. So the header, the data service, the data model, and we're exporting them all so that they're going to be available. Okay. So when this all gets built, it gets built down to a file called globalnav.js. All right, and that's big, and it's transpiled. I always say compiled. I'm an old school C# developer. So it gets transpiled down to a single JavaScript file. So that's the Common file. And that is where all the real magic happens. If we move over to SPFX, whoops, let me just do this. I'm going to start with the app customizer. There's a few things that we need to do here to set things up. The first is in our package.json file. So because this code is coming from a separate package, mainly the Common, actually, I forgot to tell you about that. Give me 1 second. In this file, in the package.js, in order to do that, in order to make this work, you need to give this package essentially what amounts to its own namespace. And so I've called this Cash-Peterson global nav common. So this is in the package.json file for my Common code. And so because of that, in my dependencies, I can reference that Common code. And so once I do my npmi, this loads that into this package and now this project, and now it's available. So there's only one file in here, and that is my global nav SPFX application customizer. And this file's job is to get those placeholders for modern top and bottom that we were just talking about, get the DOM elements for them, and then go call the launcher and set up the launcher and pass it the right properties. So the first thing, actually, before it does that, it actually gets the data. So we get the nav URL, and you can see I just hard coded it here, but you can make this dynamic if you'd like. So I go and I call my header data service. I get the data back. And then inside that was in my init method. And then on my render method, I go and I get the placeholder. So this is this placeholder provider.try create content, grabs the top placeholder name.top, and it puts it into a variable called top placeholder. Now, we want to make sure, just for proper error handling, that we check to see if top placeholder is undefined. If it's not, then we want to make sure that we don't execute this code. But in this instance, it does. So it exists. So then we're going to go and we're going to create a div element. So again, we do create element, HTML div element, top container. So we've got a container, and then we've got our placeholder. We are going to append child, our placeholder, to our container to the top placeholder. So we're basically we're grabbing the placeholder, we're creating a div element, and we're putting it inside. And when we call the launcher is going to launch things into that container. Next, we need to set up the launcher. So we instantiate the iHeader properties, and because we know iHeader properties has links in it, we're going to pass in this .navigation data.header links, which we set up in the Common file for the data service. Then we instantiate our new launcher, and we pass it in the 3 properties that it needs. It needs to know, where am I going to put things? So in this instance, it's the top container, which we just populated over here. We need to know what control it needs to go to. So we're going to tell it to put the header in. Now, and then we need to know what properties that control has. So we're going to pass in the header props. So container that the component goes in, the component, and then the properties for the component. And then we're going to call launcher.launch. And then this is going to trigger code in the common folder, in the common code that then instantiates the React component, propagates it with the properties, and then populates it and puts it on the page. We're going to do the exact same thing for the footer, for the bottom placeholder. Same thing, we're getting this time we're getting the bottom placeholder. And then we are instantiating a new instance of launcher, and we're passing in footer and footer props. Now, the only difference here is that the footer props has another another property called message, and we're putting in copyright 2020 Contoso Electronics, and then we're launching it out. All right, so now this is your application customizer, because all the heavy lifting is done in the common code. So this we can build and we can deploy just like we would deploy any other SPFX extension or web part. We package it up into an SPPKG file and we upload it to the app catalog. So what about Classic? Classic is a little different for a couple of different reasons. It still references the common code. So if you look at the package.json file, you will see in my dependencies, I've got a link to the common code. So it's still able to reference that, but it only has one file. It's got the index file. Oh, I forgot to mention actually in the other one, it's the same for both. We do need to make sure that when you're using this method that you install, that you use the require for the common component. That makes sure that everything gets bundled and that it's there right. It's there properly. So then I've got the imports for all the different components that I need. And then I've got a class called Bootstrapper. And Bootstrapper has one method called onInit. And you'll start to see some patterns here, right? So we're looking at header and footer. So we're creating some new divs. And we've got our good old friend, if you've worked in SharePoint for long enough and taken any look at the old DOM for Classic, you will know S4 ribbon row and S4 workspace. Those are sort of the bane of branding existence for SharePoint. The global nav needs to go in different spots in Classic than where it would go in modern. So here we've got the ribbon row, and that's where the header goes. The header has to go before the ribbon. So we're doing ribbon.parent insert before, and we're putting the header. This is where we're going to put the component, and it goes above the ribbon row. The footer needs to be exactly below the last thing in the workspace. So we're doing workspace.appendChild, and that creates this DOM structure that we now have somewhere to put the data. So this is going to look very familiar. So we've got our call to our data service that gets the data from this URL. Then we're setting up our properties for our header and our footer. So we've got our header links and our footer links and our copyright message. And then we're just instantiating our launchers. And so we're just swapping out this DOM element where we're going to put the code. So the difference between this and our code for SPFX is very, very similar. And that's it. So when this code gets called, it's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to find the right div. It's going to put a div inside of it, and then it's going to call the launchers. Okay. Now the big thing about Classic is how do I get it on the page, right? And that, unfortunately, we have to do with a PowerShell or with PowerShell. Not unfortunately, PowerShell is a great tool. I don't want to disparage PowerShell, but we need to do it via JS link. And so what we're doing here is, and this will all be as part of this is all part of the dev extensions and what you'll see in my public repo. So we're adding JS link for React and React DOM because SharePoint Classic doesn't know what the heck React is. And so we want to make sure that we have those loaded first. And then finally, we want to add a script link to the bundle for this build, which is Global Nav Classic. Now, one thing you'll notice here is I'm deploying it to Global Nav with SPFX, but I'm instantiating this on Global Nav Classic. You can essentially create a site anywhere you want and serve it as a CDN, as long as every user has access to it. And so in here, you could put global nav classic.js, you can put your JSON file for managing the navigation. You can essentially just create a mini CDN for you to serve things up. The one thing I will caution you on is that if you're going to do that, you need to make sure all users that need to see the global navigation have all the users that see the global navigation have read access to wherever you put these files, or else when it goes to get the file, it'll return empty. Okay, so now let's take a look and actually see it working in action. So you can see here's my app catalog. I've got my SP package, so I deployed the SPFX code here. I've got my I deployed the content to the styles library, so I've got my global nav classic.js, and then I've got my header JSON. And then we've got our header. And so if we refresh the page, this is a modern page, and hopefully I didn't break anything. We've got our global navigation. And you can see this is a lot tighter. It's centered and so forth. Could imagine when using the hub navigation, this might get a little unruly. And then we've got our footer that sits at the bottom. And so as we scroll through, that stays fixed. As we bring the page up, that stays fixed. As we bring the page, I know this is a little small probably. We bring this down, we've got our modern, and we've got our way to see the global navigation here. And so that's SPFX. And then here's our classic experience. I just created a basic classic site from the old admin center. And we've got the same navigation, the same footer, same mobile friendly functionality. Ooh. All right, with one single set of code. And so if I want to make a change to this, right? If I want to make a change to the to any of the guts of this functionality, say the CSS, or how it renders, say I want to change the code, I can come in here and I can change this to red, and then I recompile it. I can change this, and then I can rebuild this, and then I just rebuild my other two, and they will inherit it. I was sort of toying around the idea of using this file as an external as well, and then just having to update one file, but this is where I sort of ended up for today. But anyway, you can just simply update this file, and then when you redeploy, it will be red. So you get the idea that you can write one set of code, and that you can then deploy it in both a classic and a modern scenario. So that, my friends, was our time for code. I do want to talk I'm going to skip over talk very quickly about the deployment stuff. As I mentioned before, in SPFX, you do have the opportunity to deploy this to all site collections at once. So you could put this on every site. Just be aware that if you do want that, be very mindful of it, because it applies also to sites that get created by teams. Literally every site collection that is modern. It deploys to specific site collections as well. That's what I did here. I actually do that using a site-to-site script that I then add to site designs and install my SPFX extension. And then with Classic, we do need to deploy it individually to individual site collections using JSLink and PowerShell. So you could do that both through an automated provisioning engine, an Azure function, or some other method for you to get that done. All right, so we are almost at time. So just closing things up, we talked about what choices or questions you may want to ask yourself before you start to build your own components. We talked about the different pieces of those components and why you would want to use them and what impact they had. We talked a little bit about PnP and getting a kickstart on your work. And then we looked at some code examples of how I did this. And finally, some deployment options. So here are some resources. This is the PnP site that I showed everyone at the beginning. as well as the direct link to the React menu footer that Bob and Julie worked on, my Twitter and my GitHub repo, so that you can download the code from this and hopefully get a good start on getting your classic and modern navigation ironed out very quickly. So with that, I want to say thank you for spending some time with me, and open things up to questions.
There's a few questions in there for you,
Okay.
Dirk.
Okay, hang on. Where are they?
All
right. Yep.
Go.
How can you
got them?
So the first one is, how can you handle permissions in custom global navigation? Okay, so how I would handle that would be one of two ways. I would probably use that model of generating the JSON via a SharePoint list, and push some kind of like look at the SharePoint groups that have access to it. There's an overhead there for you, because there is an overhead, because you're going to need to check every time it gets rendered what groups have access to it. So it's kind of one of those things, but it's going to be expensive. So, but I would try to offload that so that it knows ahead of time what you're doing. The other thing you could potentially do is, instead of generating JSON, you could try to use search to pull back the data. If you could write specific enough cacheable queries, you could use search to pull back the list that you wanted as well, because search is already security trimmed. Will the component work on no script sites? I'm going to say, because it's all script heavy, I'm going to say absolutely not. So yeah, you do need to make sure that you can run SharePoint framework scripts there. So it might work on modern, but it's probably not going to work on classic, is my gut reaction there. And somebody else pointed out, for the data source, can you not use SharePoint API with respect to site security as well? You absolutely could do that. You could make calls to the list individually. Like I said, you could do that. That would potentially be expensive, because you would want to check those permissions and security every single time you hit it. So the answer is absolutely, but be mindful of caching and stuff like that. All right. Are there any other questions that folks have?
Thank you. That's all that I see in there.
All right. I do have the obligatory raffle slide. Follow the bit.ly, register to win an Oculus. And thank you to everyone and the sponsors and all that good stuff. If you have a few extra bucks, consider donating it to people in need, and 10% of our funds from our sponsors are going to community relief. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Excellent, Dirk. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. Folks, we'll be back in 12 minutes with Peter Ward covering Create a Bot for Microsoft Teams in Azure. Sounds exciting. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Russ. Look forward to it.
Thanks.